She has the final word on the North Pasture, and that is not changing." Clyde Wilcox said those words with a voice so steady, so iron-certain, that the silence that followed them in the dusty ranch office felt like the held breath before a thunderclap. His foreman, Hector Briggs, stood across the broad oak desk with a face gone red as a branding iron fresh from the fire, his hat crumpled in his fists, his jaw working like he was trying to chew the words back out of the air and replace them with something that made better sense. "You cannot be serious," Hector finally managed. "Wilcox, that woman has been here 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And you're handing her authority over the finest grazing land in the whole county. The men won't stand for it. Cole and Perkins are already talking. They're saying—" "I don't care what they're saying." Clyde rose from behind his desk, and the full height of him filled the low-ceilinged room the way a storm fills a valley. He was broad in the shoulder, lean in the hip, with hands that bore the permanent record of hard decades of ranching in their calluses and scars. His dark eyes held no give in them whatsoever. "Cora Keller has more sense in her little finger about land and water rights and cattle rotation than Cole and Perkins combined have in their entire bodies, and I will not hear otherwise. She stays. Her authority stays. And if Cole or Perkins don't like it, they can collect their wages from you on Friday and find work elsewhere." Hector took one long breath. He looked at his boots. He looked back up. "You know there are people in this county saying you've gone soft on account of her. That you're not thinking with your head." Something shifted in Clyde's expression then, something so subtle that a man who hadn't known him 20 years would have missed it entirely. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was something older than either of those things, something that lived in the very place he had been trying not to look at ever since the morning 6 weeks ago when Cora Keller had stepped down from the stagecoach in front of the Dry Creek General Store with a battered trunk, a surveying compass, and a letter in her hand that bore his own signature. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "Now close that door behind you, Hector." Hector closed the door. And Clyde stood alone in the room, one hand flat on the cool surface of his desk, his eyes fixed on the window that looked out north, toward the pasture in question, toward the green-gold rise of the land under the late September sun of 1882. He could see her from here if he looked carefully enough. A small figure in a practical brown skirt and a wide-brimmed straw hat, walking the fence line with a notebook in her hand, and a surveying rod tucked under her arm, completely absorbed, completely unaware that a small war was being fought over her inside these walls. He watched her for a long moment. Then he turned away, because he was afraid of what his own face might do if he kept watching. To understand how Clyde Wilcox arrived at that moment, defending a woman he had known barely 6 weeks with a conviction that bordered on recklessness, you have to go back to the beginning of that September, to the letter his attorney brother had written him from Abilene, to the particular shape of the desperation that had made Clyde Wilcox, one of the proudest cattlemen in Harlan County, Texas, do something he had never in 42 years of life imagined himself doing. He had needed help. That was the plain fact of it, and Clyde Wilcox was not a man who tolerated plain facts that humbled him. The Wilcox Ranch, 3,000 acres of Texas grassland that his father had carved out of nothing in the years just after the war, was in trouble. Not the dramatic, visible kind of trouble that other men had, not drought or fire or cattle thieves, but a quieter and in many ways more dangerous kind. The land was being mismanaged, and Clyde knew it, and the knowing of it ate at him like rust eats iron. He was a cattleman. He understood cattle the way some men understand music, instinctively, from the inside out. But the science of the land itself, the rotation of pastures, the management of water resources, the systematic analysis of soil and grass health that was beginning to transform ranching in the 1880s, that was another matter. He had watched his North Pasture degrade over 3 seasons of overgrazing while he argued with himself about what to do about it. And now it was near the point of no recovery. His brother Marcus, who had studied law in the East before settling in Abilene, and developing an extensive network of useful acquaintances, wrote to him in late August with a proposition. There was a woman in Kansas City who had been working as a land and range consultant for 2 years, having been trained by a professor at the Kansas State Agricultural College, one of the few such institutions in the country that had quietly and practically admitted a small number of women to its programs. Her name was Cora Keller. She was 28 years old, a widow of 4 years, and she had an extraordinary record with the ranches and farms she had consulted for. She was also, Marcus noted in a postscript that Clyde read 3 times, looking for work, having recently been dismissed from a position in Wichita when the rancher's wife had taken an irrational disliking to her and insisted she be let go. Clyde had written back requesting more information. Marcus had written back with more information. Clyde had written to Cora Keller herself with a formal inquiry. She had replied with a letter so precise, so detailed in its analysis of the general principles of range management, and so direct in its questions about the specific conditions of his land, that he had sat with it for 2 days before responding. Then he had written an offer. She had countered. He had accepted, and so the arrangement had been made. He had expected a capable person. He had not expected Cora Keller. She stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek on the 1st of September, 1882, and the first thing she did after scanning the small crowd of curious onlookers was identify him by his stature and the quality of his horse and walk directly to him and extend her hand. "Mr. Wilcox, I am Cora Keller. I read your last 2 letters carefully on the journey, and I have some preliminary thoughts I would like to share with you once we reach the ranch, if that suits you. The north-facing water table situation you described is going to be the central challenge, I believe, more so than the grass itself." He shook her hand. He looked at her. She was a slight woman, maybe 5'3", with dark auburn hair pinned practically under that wide-brimmed hat, brown eyes that were very direct and very clear, a mouth that showed the particular resolute set of someone who had learned to say difficult things calmly. She was not pretty in any conventional decorative sense. She was striking, in the way that useful, precisely made things are striking. "Welcome to Dry Creek, Miss Keller," he said, because she had signed her letters that way and he did not presume. "We can talk on the way." They had talked the whole way, 40 minutes of riding from town to the ranch, and she had pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and asked him questions that no one had ever asked him about his own land, questions about seasonal water flow patterns and the composition of the soil in different quadrants and the specific rotation schedule of his cattle herds over the past 5 years. He answered them all as accurately as he could. She wrote everything down in a small, neat hand. At the end of the 40 minutes, as they turned up the long drive to the ranch house, she had said, "You have a recoverable situation. It will take 2, perhaps 3 seasons of disciplined management, but the land wants to recover. It just needs someone to listen to it carefully." "You talk about land like it's a living thing," he said. "It is a living thing," she replied, without any defensiveness, just matter of fact. He had shown her the guest room in the main house, which she had accepted without comment, and introduced her to Hector Briggs, who had been his foreman for 11 years and who had regarded her with the measured skepticism of a man who had seen too many outside consultants come and go. She had been polite to Hector. She had also, within her first week, gently but thoroughly dismantled every assumption Hector held about the best use of the North Pasture, backing each point with observations from the land itself, measurements, and references to published work from the Agricultural College. Hector had not enjoyed that week. Clyde had found himself enjoying it more than he had expected. He made a habit of joining her in the evenings on the front porch after supper, ostensibly to hear her daily report on what she had observed and what she recommended. But as the days passed and the evenings stretched out under the enormous Texas sky going orange and purple, and then deep blue above them, he began to understand that what he was really doing was looking for reasons to keep the conversation going. She had opinions about things beyond land management. She had read widely and thought carefully and had no patience for fashionable nonsense. But she listened well, genuinely well, with a quality of attention that was rare enough that Clyde had not fully recognized it for what it was until he found himself saying things out loud that he had never said to anyone. About his father, about the weight of inheritance, about the years after his wife, Margaret, had died of fever when their son was 2, and how he had rebuilt himself around the ranch the way a man will sometimes rebuild himself around the one thing he is absolutely certain about, because the alternative is to face the uncertainty, and that is harder. She had listened to all of that without rushing to fill the silence when he finished, and then she had said very quietly, "I understand that. After my husband died, I buried myself in the work too. It is not a bad way to survive. The question is whether you want to only survive or whether you eventually want something more." He had not known what to say to that. He had looked at the stars for a long time. She had not seemed to require an answer. That was in the 2nd week. By the 3rd week, he was aware of something warm and alarming growing in the middle of his chest whenever she came into a room. By the 4th week, he was deliberately positioning himself to be wherever she was working, inventing transparent pretexts to observe her process, her methodical way of moving across the land with her instruments and her notebook, her total absorption in whatever she was examining, the small frown of concentration she got between her brows when something did not add up. By the 5th week, he had stopped inventing pretexts and was simply present, and she had begun simply including him, explaining what she was seeing, pointing things out, sharing the small discoveries of her day with the natural ease of someone who has decided she trusts a person. He realized with a terror that surprised him enormously, falling in love with her. At 42 years old, having been a widower for nearly a decade, having put that particular door firmly closed and bolted, he was falling in love with his land consultant, a woman 14 years younger than him, a woman he had hired, a woman who had come here to do a professional job, and had made no indication whatsoever that she regarded him as anything other than a capable rancher with a good land problem and decent evening conversation. He had handled this revelation the way he handled most things that alarmed him. He said nothing about it. He maintained his professional reserve. He continued to treat her with the same respectful seriousness he had from the first day, and he fought his own battle inside his own chest in private, which was exactly the kind of battle Clyde Wilcox had the most experience winning. What he had not anticipated was Hector's confrontation in week 6, or the way that confrontation would force his hand. The trouble had been building since the end of the 2nd week, when Cora had presented her first formal recommendation to the ranch's working crew at the bunkhouse meeting Clyde held at the end of each month. She had recommended the full rest of the North Pasture for one complete season, the rerouting of the smallest creek tributary to better distribute water across the eastern section, and the staggered rotation of the cattle herds in a pattern that was more labor-intensive than what the men were accustomed to. She had explained all of this clearly and answered every question asked of her. The questions had been respectful enough in tone but skeptical in substance. Hector had not attended that meeting. He had sent word that he was occupied with the horse corrals. Clyde had noted his absence and said nothing about it at the time. Over the following weeks, a faction had formed among the ranch hands, centered on Hector himself, though Hector was careful enough not to say anything directly to Clyde. Cole, the senior day rider, and Perkins, who managed the southern section, were its most vocal members. Their objections were practical on the surface: the extra labor of the new rotation, the inconvenience of the rested North Pasture, the time required for the creek rerouting work. But underneath the practical objections was something else: the simpler and more stubborn resistance of men who did not like being told what to do by a woman, and would not have admitted that openly even under considerable pressure. Cora knew about the faction. She was not a fool and she was not unobservant. She had navigated versions of this before, in Wichita and in 2 of the Kansas operations, and she had developed a method which was to continue working, continue being correct, and not give the opposition anything emotional to grab onto. She never showed frustration to the men. She never appealed to Clyde's authority on her behalf. She built her case in the language of results, and she let the land speak for her when words were not sufficient. By the end of the 5th week, the section of creek she had rerouted was already showing the effects she had predicted. The eastern pasture grass, which had been thin and dry at the edges, was visibly greening. 3 of the ranch hands who had initially been skeptical had quietly shifted their allegiance, recognizing good management when they saw it at work. Cole and Perkins had not shifted. Hector had not shifted. And on the morning of the day of Clyde's confrontation with his foreman, Hector had come to the office with a formal demand, backed by the implied threat that Cole and Perkins might leave if it was not met, that Cora's authority over the North Pasture be revoked, and her recommendations reviewed and approved by Hector himself before implementation. Clyde had listened to the whole thing. He had let Hector finish. He had looked at him for a long moment, and then he had said what he said. She has the final word on the North Pasture, and that is not changing. The afternoon after the confrontation with Hector, Clyde walked out to the North Pasture himself. He did not have any particular agricultural purpose. He walked out there because he needed air and space, and because he knew where she was. She was crouched near the fence line at the eastern boundary of the North Pasture, examining a section of soil with a kind of focused intensity that made her completely unaware of his approach until he was 15 feet away. Then she heard his boots on the dry ground and looked up, and there was a brief unguarded moment where something crossed her face before she composed it back into her usual clear, professional expression. He could not have said with certainty what that unguarded expression had been. It had been too quick, but it had not been merely professional recognition, and he held it in his mind carefully. "Mr. Wilcox," she said, rising and brushing the dirt from her hands. "I wanted to talk to you about what I found along this section of the fence." The soil composition shifts quite significantly within about 30 yards, which suggests there may have been a different land use pattern here before your father's time. If that is the case, there are some implications for Hector came to me this morning, he said. She went still. Her hands came together in front of her, a gesture he had noticed she made when she was steadying herself for something. "I suspected he would. He wants your authority revoked over the North Pasture. I know what he wants." "I have known for some time what he wants." She looked at him directly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you have the final word on the North Pasture, and that is not changing." Something moved in her expression again. Not relief exactly, though relief was part of it. Something more complicated, something that had to do with surprise, and surprise had not been the outcome she had permitted herself to expect. She had been, he understood in that moment, preparing for a different answer. She had been preparing to accept a different answer. "Clyde," she said. It was the first time she had called him by his first name, though he had asked her to weeks ago, and she had continued to use his surname with a formality he had attributed to professionalism and now suddenly wondered about differently. "You did not have to do that." "I know I didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to. The work you are doing here is sound and it is right, and I am not going to let men who are more threatened by competence than they are committed to this ranch's future undermine it." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. Somewhere to the east a killdeer called. The afternoon light lay golden and heavy across the pasture, the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look like they have meaning. "Cole and Perkins may leave," she said. "Then they leave. I can find men who work a plan. I cannot find land that recovers itself after mismanagement, and I am not willing to sacrifice what you are doing here to keep men who would rather be comfortable than correct." She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before. He had seen her focused, analytical, patient, occasionally amused in a quiet way. He had not seen her look at anything the way she was looking at him now, like she was seeing something she had not quite believed was there. "Thank you," she said simply. "You don't have to thank me for doing the right thing," he said, and he meant that. But he also heard himself say it and understood it was the kind of thing a man says when he is trying very hard not to say the other thing, the larger thing, the thing that would change everything. They stood there in the golden afternoon, 5 feet apart, and the air between them had a quality that Clyde Wilcox, who was not a man given to romantic imagination, nonetheless recognized as significant. "I should continue recording these measurements before the light changes," she said. "Of course," he said. "Don't let me interrupt you." He walked back toward the house without looking back, which required more will than almost anything he had done in recent memory. Hector departed 3 days later. It was not as dramatic as Clyde had expected, which was sometimes the nature of these things. Cole and Perkins left first, collecting their wages on a Thursday morning with the stiff dignity of men who believe they are making a principled stand and do not want to examine it too closely. Hector came to the office the following Monday and told Clyde that he thought it was time for him to move on, that he had been offered a position with the Galloway outfit over in the next county, which Clyde suspected was not true but was a decent enough fiction for both of them. Clyde thanked him for 11 years of work. He meant it. Hector shook his hand and left. There were 4 ranch hands who stayed, the younger men, and one of them, a quiet, capable young man named Doster who had been working the ranch for 2 years, proved within a week to be natural Foreman material. Clyde offered him the position. Doster accepted it with a seriousness that was reassuring. Cora noticed the change in the atmosphere immediately. The ranch felt different without the friction, lighter somehow, the work able to move more naturally and quickly without the constant undercurrent of resistance. She noticed Doster working with the new rotation system with a straightforward diligence that made her visibly relax in ways Clyde had not realized she had been holding tension until she stopped holding it. He noticed everything about her. He noticed the way she wore her hair differently on windy days, braided and pinned close. He noticed that she took her coffee black and without sugar, and that she was awake before anyone else on the ranch, that she walked the western fence line at dawn as a way of thinking, that she laughed at things most people did not find funny, and did not laugh at things most people did, that she was unsentimental about almost everything except soil and water and growing things, where her feeling ran surprisingly deep. He noticed that on the evenings when he joined her on the porch, she had begun to face him more directly, turned slightly in her chair toward him rather than toward the yard, a small physical orientation that he had measured as carefully as she measured her survey distances. He noticed that she had stopped calling him Mr. Wilcox and never quite explained the shift. It had simply happened, and now he was Clyde to her in conversation, and the sound of his name in her voice was one of the better sounds he had encountered in 42 years of listening to the world. He also noticed that she never initiated a conversation that moved beyond the professional and the practical and the comfortably friendly. She was warm with him, genuinely warm, but she maintained a careful border, and he did not know whether the border was there because she did not feel what he felt, or because she had reasons of her own not to act on what she felt, or because she was waiting for something from him that he had not yet managed to provide. The answer to that question came to him unexpectedly in early October, on a Sunday afternoon when the ranch work was quiet. He found her sitting on the split-rail fence at the south end of the North Pasture, which was already showing remarkable improvement after 5 weeks of rest, the grass thickening and greening at the roots in a way that was almost visibly alive. She was not working. She had no notebook, no instruments. She was simply sitting on the fence looking at the recovering land with an expression on her face that was private and complex and that she did not immediately compose when she saw him coming, which told him she had not heard his approach this time either. "You look pleased," he said. "I am pleased. Look at it," she said simply. She gestured at the pasture. "It wants to live, I told you." He came and leaned his arms on the top rail of the fence beside her, close enough that he was acutely aware of the few inches between them. He looked at the pasture. He could see exactly what she meant. The recovery was unmistakable. It was the kind of vindication that ought to make a person smug, and she was not smug about it at all. She was simply glad. "I owe you a significant debt," he said. "You hired me and paid me and defended my authority. That is the end of any debt." "No," he said. "I mean something different." He looked at her. She was still looking at the pasture, but he could see from the stillness of her that she knew something was shifting in the conversation. "I mean that you came here and you did something with this land that I could not do. That mattered. It mattered to me in ways I did not entirely expect." She turned her head and looked at him. Those clear brown eyes that never quite let a person off the hook. "What did you expect?" she asked. "I expected a capable person who would solve a problem and leave," he said honestly. "I did not expect—" He stopped. He had never been a man who stumbled over words. He was stumbling now. "I did not expect to find myself in the particular position I am in." Silence. The wind in the pasture grass. Very far away, a train whistle from the direction of Dry Creek. "What position is that?" she asked, and her voice was very careful. "The position of being quite significantly invested in whether you stay," he said. "Not as a professional matter, as a personal one." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. He watched her profile, the slight lift of her chin, the steadying breath she took. "Clyde," she said, "I should tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "When I was dismissed from my position in Wichita, it was not simply because the rancher's wife disliked me. That was part of it, but it was more complicated. The rancher himself had made certain things clear to me about what he expected in exchange for continued employment. And when I declined very firmly to provide those things, his wife's dislike became a convenient explanation for what was in fact his own decision to let me go." She said all of this evenly, without drama, but he could see what the evenness cost her. "I tell you this because you deserve to know why I am careful, why I maintain certain distances. The line between professional and personal is one I watch very closely now, because I have learned what it costs to misread it." He was quiet for a moment, taking in what she had said and what it meant, and what it must have cost her to navigate, not just in Wichita but in all the places that preceded it. A woman doing work that most people did not believe women could or should do, in an environment that offered her essentially no protection and no recourse. "I hear you," he said. "I want you to understand what I am not saying. I am not offering you continued employment in exchange for anything other than the work you are doing. Your position here is not contingent on anything personal. I want to be very clear about that. What I am saying, separately, is that I would very much like your company in ways that have nothing to do with cattle or land if you are willing to give it, and that I would like to know you better, and that I think, if I am reading things correctly, though I am aware I may not be, that the evenings on the porch have meant something to you as well." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze and let her look. "You are not misreading things," she said finally. "I have been quite deliberate about not letting you read them correctly, for the reasons I just described." "Those were good reasons," he said. "Do you still require them?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "You are a good man, Clyde Wilcox. I have believed that since the second week. But believing a man is good and trusting him entirely with something that matters are different things." "They are," he agreed. "I am not asking you to trust me entirely. I am asking you to let me sit with you on the porch this evening and see where the conversation goes." Something shifted in her expression then, and the thing that shifted looked very much like the careful beginning of something, the first cautious crocus of a feeling she had been keeping underground. "I think I can manage that," she said. They sat on the porch that evening for 3 hours. They talked about everything. They talked about her childhood in Missouri, the father who had been a farmer with an unusual belief in education, and who had sent her to every school he could manage, and then pushed her toward the agricultural college, because he had recognized something in her that most people did not see. They talked about the husband she had lost, a kind and bookish man named Paul Keller who had died of a sudden illness at 30, and who she had loved and mourned properly, and whose memory she held with tenderness, but no longer with the sharp edge of active grief. They talked about Clyde's son, Thomas, who was 10 years old and living in Abilene with Clyde's brother and sister-in-law while he attended school, who came to the ranch for summers and holidays and who Clyde missed with a steady ache he had learned to carry. "He sounds remarkable," she said. "He is. He will be a better man than I am, I think." "I doubt that very much," she said, and she said it simply and directly the way she said most things, and the color it put in his face was not something he could have prevented. After that evening something settled between them. The careful distance did not vanish overnight. She was too sensible for that, and he was too respectful of her sensibility to push against it. But the border shifted. She allowed him closer in small increments, measured and deliberate as her survey work. She let him ride out with her in the morning sometimes, the two of them moving across the land together in the early light, talking or not talking, the horses moving easily beside each other. She began to ask him things about himself that were not professionally relevant, about what he read, about his opinions on things, about the choices he had made and not made and regretted and did not regret. He was patient in a way he had not known himself to be capable of. He was patient because he understood that what she was doing was the most reasonable thing a person in her position could do, and because every increment she gave him felt like something genuinely given, not extracted, not manipulated into, and that quality of gift was worth more to him than speed. In mid-October, Thomas came to visit for the school break, arriving on the Friday stage from Abilene with a carpetbag and a new pocket knife, and the particular excited energy of a boy who has been in school for weeks and is desperate for open land. He was a bright, direct child with Clyde's dark eyes and his mother's fair coloring, and he absorbed the presence of Cora Keller in the household with the pragmatic adaptability of a child who has been raised in interesting circumstances. He was fascinated by her work immediately. She made the mistake, from the perspective of anyone trying to limit the conversation, of showing him her instruments on the first day, the surveying compass and the soil coring tool and the water testing equipment she had sent away from a supplier in Kansas City. Thomas was thereafter completely devoted to her and appeared at her side during every working hour she would permit, asking questions that she answered fully and seriously. Clyde watched this from a calculated distance, pretending to be occupied with other things, and felt something in his chest that was large and warm and a little frightening in its largeness. "He is wonderful," she told him one evening, and the way she said it was not performance, not polite. She said it the way she said things about recovering grass, with genuine feeling. "He thinks you are extraordinary," Clyde said. "He told me so. He told me that my surveying compass was extraordinary, which is not quite the same thing, but I will take it." The small smile she gave him then, the slightly wry, slightly warm one that was different from her professional pleasantness. He had come to understand that smile as something he had earned, not something she gave to everyone, and it was worth more to him than he could have rationally explained. Thomas went back to Abilene on the following Wednesday. He hugged his father at the stage, and then, to Clyde's startled pleasure, he turned and hugged Cora with the unself-conscious wholeness of a child who has decided a person is worth the gesture. She hugged him back without stiffness and told him to write her with any more questions about soil composition, which he clearly took as a serious invitation. After the stage pulled away, she stood beside Clyde in the dusty street, and they both watched it go. "He is going to be fine," she said. "More than fine." "I know," Clyde said. And then, because the moment felt right in a way that had nothing calculated about it, "Cora." She turned and looked at him. "I would very much like to take you to dinner this Saturday, in town at the hotel dining room, not as your employer, as a man who thinks very highly of you and would like to see you somewhere other than a pasture or a porch." She held his gaze for a long moment. He waited. "All right," she said. "Saturday." The hotel dining room in Dry Creek was not elaborate, but it was the best the town offered, with white tablecloths and real china and a proprietress, Mrs. Beaumont, who prided herself on her fried chicken and her apple pie. Clyde arrived in a clean coat, and she arrived in a dress he had not seen before, dark blue, simple, nothing fussy about it. But on her the simplicity was striking in the same way everything about her was striking once you learned to see her properly. They had dinner and they talked for 2 hours, and he began to understand that the shift from employer and employee to something else was not as complicated as he had feared, because they had been building toward this for weeks in the small daily currency of 2 people who genuinely like and respect each other. The conversation moved easily. She made him laugh twice in ways that were real and unguarded, and she laughed herself, more than he usually saw her laugh, her whole face involved in it. When he walked her home to the ranch under a sky absolutely crowded with stars, their arms close enough that he could feel the warmth of her even without touching, he stopped at the gate before the porch and turned to face her. "I had a very good evening," she said before he could say anything. "So did I," he said. "The best I have had in quite a long time." They stood there for a moment, and he did not push anything, did not reach for anything. He was learning, with her, the particular value of waiting. "Good night, Clyde," she said. "Good night, Cora." She went inside. He stood at the gate for a moment, looking up at the stars, and the night felt enormous and generously full of possibility. He asked her to dinner again the following Saturday, and she said yes. And the Saturday after that. By November, the dinners at the hotel had become a settled part of the week's rhythm, an appointment they both kept with the kind of natural ease that comes from something that has stopped being an experiment and become a habit of the best kind. By the middle of November, he was holding her hand as they walked, and she let him, and the first time he had done it she had looked at their joined hands for a moment, and then looked up at him with an expression that was careful and open at the same time, and he had said nothing, just kept walking, and she had let him keep walking. November was also the month the water rights situation arrived, which was the second serious crisis of the season and which nearly derailed everything. A rancher named Hollis Draper, whose land bordered the Wilcox property to the northwest, filed a formal claim with the county land office asserting that the creek tributary Cora had rerouted in September was legally part of his water rights, and that the rerouting constituted an illegal diversion of his water access. Clyde knew Draper. He was a man of middling competence and large ambition, the kind of man who looked at any neighboring success and immediately began calculating what he might extract from it. Draper had not liked the Wilcox operation for years, had been quietly hostile across their shared boundary, and this claim was transparently an opportunistic strike rather than a legitimate grievance. But in 1882 Texas, water rights were a serious legal matter, and the claim had to be taken seriously. Clyde wrote immediately to Marcus in Abilene, requesting his legal assistance. Marcus wrote back that he would come to Dry Creek at the end of the month to review the situation. In the meantime, Cora had been doing her own work on the matter. She had pulled the original land surveys from the county record's office in Dry Creek, which she had accessed by presenting herself with a professional directness that had slightly confused the county clerk, who was not accustomed to women requesting access to survey documents. She had spent 2 full days with the documents and her instruments in the field, and when she came to find Clyde in the evening with a stack of papers and her notebook, she was carrying herself with the particular focused energy she had when she was very certain of something. "Draper's claim is false," she said. "Not just legally questionable, actually false." The original survey from 1871, which is the controlling document for both properties' water rights, clearly establishes that the tributary in question follows a path that was already split by a natural fork before your father ever built the original diversion structure. The water I rerouted came from your side of that fork. Draper's claim is on the other branch entirely, which is still completely untouched. He has either not read the 1871 survey or is counting on no one else having read it recently. She laid the documents on the table. She showed him exactly what she was describing. He looked at it. He could see precisely what she meant. "You need a copy of this for your brother," she said. "I have already made one. I would also recommend having a county surveyor independently verify my measurements, because an independent verification will be more useful in any formal proceeding than my word alone, and I know that is a hard truth, but it is the practical one." It was indeed a hard truth, the specific kind that came from knowing exactly what one's word was worth in certain rooms. He looked at her and felt something that was half admiration and half a quiet fury on her behalf that he carefully did not express because she had not expressed it herself, and to express it uninvited would be presuming on her experience in a way she had not invited. "You are right," he said. "I will arrange the county surveyor, and I am going to have Marcus use this in the strongest possible terms when he arrives." Marcus arrived at the end of November, a lean, sharp-minded man 5 years Clyde's junior who took one look at Cora Keller, and then took a longer look, and thereafter directed most of his questions to her, because she was clearly the most informed person in the room. The legal review was thorough and quick. Marcus confirmed everything Cora had found, verified the relevant documents, and drew up a formal response to Draper's claim that he described, with quiet professional satisfaction, as airtight. The county surveyor's independent verification, completed the following week, confirmed Cora's measurements exactly. The Draper claim was formally dismissed by the county land office in mid-December, with a note in the record that the claimant's filing had been factually unsupported by the relevant survey documents. Draper, when informed of the outcome, was reportedly furious and briefly suggested he might pursue additional remedies, but Marcus had made the counter-documentation sufficiently thorough that there were no additional remedies available to him. He faded back to his side of the property line and did not trouble them again. On the evening the dismissal letter arrived from the county land office, Clyde brought out a bottle of good whiskey he had been keeping for occasions that merited it. He poured 2 glasses and brought them out to the porch where Cora was sitting in the cooling December air wrapped in her wool shawl, reading a letter from the agricultural college in Kansas that had arrived in the week's mail. "The Draper business is finished," he said. "The claim was dismissed." She looked up from her letter. Something released in her face, a tension she had been maintaining so steadily and for so long that the absence of it changed the whole character of her expression. "Good," she said. And then, which was not like her, she put her face in her hands for just a moment, just one moment. When she looked up again her eyes were bright. "I know," he said. He sat down beside her close. "I know." She reached over and took the glass of whiskey from his hand without asking. She took a sip. He sat with his own glass and the relief of a concluded fight, and they were quiet together for a while in a way that was completely comfortable. After a little while she said, without quite looking at him, "The letter from the college is a job offer, a consulting position in Colorado. They want me to begin in March." The whiskey went still in his glass. "Colorado," he said. "Yes." The silence stretched between them. It had a different quality than their comfortable silences. This one had weight. "Is it a good offer?" he managed. "It is an excellent offer. It is the kind of work I went to the college to do. Large-scale range assessment, multiple properties, full professional authority without having to argue for every decision." She paused. "It is the kind of offer I have been working toward for 5 years." He looked at his glass. He thought about everything he could say. He thought about his pride, which he had always been told was his most significant failing, and about whether he was prepared to let that pride stop him from saying what needed to be said. "Cora," he said, "I am going to say something, and I want you to know it is not said from the perspective of your employer, because I am your employer and that is a position I am going to be very careful not to use unfairly. I am saying it entirely as myself, as a man." She turned and looked at him. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in love with you since September." I was not prepared for it, and I am not particularly easy about it, but it is true, and I think you deserve to know it before you make any decisions about Colorado." The night was quiet around them. The stars were enormous and close above the Texas plain. He kept his eyes on her. She looked at him for a long time. He could not read her expression, and for a moment that terrified him because he could usually read her at least partially. "Clyde," she said, her voice was careful and very honest, "I need to ask you something. Ask me anything. If I said yes to Colorado, if I decided to go, would you still think well of me? Would you understand it, or would you hold it against me?" He thought about it. He gave the question the honest weight it deserved. "I would be heartbroken," he said. "I would think about you every day. I would miss you in ways that would probably irritate me for a very long time, but I would not hold it against you. Because you have worked for this and you deserve the work, and I have no right to your life simply because I love you." He paused. "But I would very much like the chance to give you a reason to stay." She breathed in slowly. Her hands came together in that steadying gesture he knew. He waited. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been working very hard not to be, for the reasons I explained. But there it is." "There it is," he said. "That does not automatically solve the Colorado question," she said, with a steadiness that was characteristic of her and that he actually loved. The fact that feeling something enormous did not cause her to stop thinking. "No," he said, "it doesn't. But it changes what we are actually deciding. We are not deciding whether you go to Colorado for a job. We are deciding something about what we want our lives to look like, and that is a decision I think we should make together." He turned to face her fully. "I am not asking you to give up anything. I am asking you to consider whether there is a version of things where you have the work you want and also have this, whatever this is becoming." She was quiet for a long moment. He let her be quiet. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "I am proposing that we do not make any decisions tonight," he said. "That we take the rest of December and the new year and we let ourselves figure out who we are to each other, and then we decide, together." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. "That is a reasonable proposal." "I am occasionally reasonable," he said. "You are frequently reasonable," she said. "You are also frequently stubborn and proud and occasionally maddening." "That is fair," he said. "I think you should know that I see all of it," she said. "The reasonable and the stubborn and the proud. I am not in love with a version of you that I have simplified." "I know you aren't," he said. "That is one of the things I love about you most." She held his gaze. And then, carefully, she leaned toward him, and he met her in the middle, and they kissed for the first time on that December porch under the Texas stars, and it was not tentative or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that happens when two people have been moving toward each other for a very long time and have finally arrived. December was full of that new warmth between them, a thing that no longer needed to hide itself, that had been given permission to exist openly, and was expanding into the space it had been given. He kissed her good night at the end of evenings. She reached for his hand without him offering it first. There were moments of such simple pleasure in each other's company, reading by the fireplace in the evenings, riding out together in the early mornings, that Clyde found himself experiencing the specific happiness of a man who has been genuinely lonely for a very long time and has stopped being lonely, and who is fully aware of the distance between those two states. They wrote to Thomas about the situation. Clyde in his usual direct father's language, and Cora in a letter that she wrote herself and showed Clyde before sending, careful and warm, and honest about what was developing and what she hoped for. Thomas wrote back with a single enthusiastic sentence about how he had known this was going to happen when he visited in October, because of the way they looked at each other, which made Cora laugh out loud and made Clyde shake his head, with the particular affectionate exasperation of a parent who is being seen more clearly than he intended. The Colorado question did not resolve itself immediately. They talked about it carefully, in pieces, over several evenings. Clyde made inquiries, through Marcus, about the range consulting field in Texas generally, about whether there were comparable opportunities developing closer to home. Cora wrote to the college in Colorado with questions about the position's terms and timeline. She also made some discreet inquiries of her own about the land management consulting market in Texas, which was less developed than in Colorado but not absent. What they arrived at, after long and genuinely collaborative conversation, was a plan that required Cora to decline the Colorado position, but that also required Clyde to make a significant investment in establishing a formal consulting arrangement that would allow her to work professionally with other ranches and land operations across the county and the region, not just his own. He would not be her only client. She would have professional independence and professional standing, her work formalized and compensated as such. It was not the Colorado offer, but it was not a sacrifice of everything she had worked toward either. It was something they had built together from what they both needed. She declined the Colorado offer in a letter she wrote in mid-January, at the ranch house desk, in the lamplight with him sitting nearby reading, and when she sealed it and set it aside, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And she was, he could see that she was, though she was also being honest with herself about what she was giving up and what she was choosing. "I think this is right. I think we are building something worth building." "We are," he said firmly. He asked her to marry him in February. He did not make a grand production of it because she was not a woman who wanted a grand production. She had told him plainly once that she found performative sentiment embarrassing, which he had filed carefully. He asked her on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table over coffee, straightforwardly, telling her that he wanted to share his life with her, and that he would do his best to be worthy of what she would be bringing to that life, and asking if she would be willing to marry him. She put down her coffee cup. She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. "Yes," she said. "I am willing. I want to." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned her hand over and held his. They were married in April of 1883 in Dry Creek at the Methodist church where Clyde had occasionally attended services and which had a minister who was practical enough not to ask too many questions about the fact that the bride had been living and working at the groom's ranch for 7 months prior to the ceremony. Marcus came from Abilene and stood with his brother. Thomas came from school with barely concealed excitement and stood beside his father with a formal solemnity that very nearly held through the ceremony and broke apart into the brightest grin Clyde had ever seen on his son's face when the minister pronounced them married. Cora wore a dress the color of cream, practical enough for the frontier but with a small lace collar she had added herself, and she carried wildflowers from the ranch property that she had cut herself that morning, white and blue, and a small amount of yellow. She was, Clyde thought, standing at the front of the small church watching her walk toward him, the most beautiful thing he had ever had the good fortune to see, and he was aware in that moment of the specific scale of what he was about to be trusted with and the weight of his intention to deserve it. She reached him. She looked at him. "Ready?" she asked very quietly because that was Cora, checking that everyone was genuinely present. "Since September," he said. She smiled with her whole face, and they turned together toward the minister. The North Pasture was fully recovered by the spring of 1883. The evidence was unmistakable, the grass thick and healthy, the water distribution working exactly as she had planned, the soil composition stabilizing in the ways she had predicted it would. When the cattle were rotated back into the North Pasture for the first time in a season, they moved into the grass with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of animals encountering abundance, and Clyde stood at the fence watching them and felt a pride that was different from any other pride he had known, because it was not simply his own achievement, it was built with someone else's knowledge and care. Cora stood beside him and watched the cattle settle into the recovered grass with a satisfaction that was quiet and complete. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." "I was right about the land," she said. "I needed you to be right about the people. We each did our part." He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned against him. They stood there watching the cattle in the recovered pasture as the spring sun came over the eastern rise and the whole valley lit up gold and green around them. Doster had proven himself, through the winter and into the spring, to be everything Clyde had hoped for as a foreman. He had taken to Cora's management systems with a practical intelligence that had impressed her, and the working relationship between the three of them, the rancher, the foreman, and the land consultant, had settled into an effective and respectful collaboration that made the ranch function better than it had in years. 2 new hands had been hired in January, recommended by Marcus through a contact in Abilene, and they proved steady and competent. The ranch at the start of the 1883 season was in better shape than it had been in at least 5 years. The land recovering, the operation running with a coherence it had not had before, the numbers, which Cora had also quietly overhauled in consultation with Clyde during the winter, cleaner and more hopeful. In June, Clyde received a letter from a rancher named Armbruster in the neighboring county, asking whether the woman he had heard was consulting on range management might be available to look at a water rights situation on his eastern pasture. He brought the letter to Cora. She read it. She looked up at him. He nodded. "Your work," he said. She wrote back to Armbruster and they established a consulting arrangement. She rode out to the Armbruster ranch twice in July, handling the situation with the same methodical thoroughness she had brought to the Wilcox ranch's problems, and her recommendation was followed and proved effective within a month. Armbruster told 2 neighbors. By September, she had 4 consulting clients outside of the Wilcox ranch. She kept her own records, her own accounts, her own professional correspondence. She had an office now, a small room in the main house that had previously been storage, cleared out and fitted with a proper desk and shelving for her documents and instruments. Her name appeared on her professional correspondence as Cora Wilcox, which she had elected to use professionally, while sometimes still thinking of herself as Keller in the deepest internal places where habit lives, and which Clyde never pressed her about one way or the other. Their life together had a particular quality in those first years that both of them recognized as remarkable, which was that they were genuinely interested in each other. Not in the contracted, obligatory way of some married partnerships, but in the live and curious way of 2 people who actually want to know what the other is thinking and doing and experiencing. Their evenings were still the best part of Clyde's day, though now they were the evenings of married life, a closeness that had deepened considerably and that had about it a quality of rightness, of fit, that he had not known he was missing until it arrived. He told his brother Marcus during a visit in the fall of 1883, happier than he had been since before Margaret died, and it was a different kind of happiness than that had been, not the happiness of youth but something more built, more knowing, more grateful. Marcus, who had watched the whole thing unfold from a respectful distance, looked at his brother across the dinner table with a satisfaction he did not bother to disguise. "I knew when I wrote you that letter that she was the right person for the situation," he said. "You knew she was the right professional," Clyde said. "I knew she was the right everything," Marcus said placidly. "I just was not sure you were going to be smart enough to recognize it." Cora, from across the table, raised her wine glass in a small salute to Marcus, who raised his in return. In the spring of 1884, she told him she was expecting their child. She told him in the morning, before breakfast, in the direct way she had always told him everything that mattered, and she watched his face when she said it with the clear eyes that never missed anything. His face did briefly, something he could not have controlled if he had wanted to. It went through a sequence of emotions that started at surprise and moved through something that was not quite joy only because joy is too simple a word for what it was. Something more like the feeling of being handed something you had decided you did not dare to want again. "Are you well?" he asked, because that was what he said first, which she found funny later. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am healthy and the work is manageable, and I expect to be working until quite close to the time. The armbruster situation is going to need a follow-up visit in July, which I intend to make. Cora, he said. I am not fragile, she said. I will make sensible decisions as we go, but I am telling you now because I thought you should know, and because she paused and something softer moved across her face, because I am glad. I want you to know that I am genuinely glad. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with more feeling than he usually let himself display before breakfast, and she held him back with exactly the same amount of feeling. Thomas was informed by letter and wrote back a response of 3 pages that was by turns excited, thoughtful, and full of advice about what kind of a sibling he hoped it would be, revealing rather a lot about his opinions and character. Cora read the letter twice and loved him even more than she already had. The boy was born in November of 1884, healthy and loud, and undeniably present from the first moment. They named him Samuel Marcus Wilcox, the middle name after the uncle who had set the whole thing in motion with a letter about a land consultant in Kansas City, and who received the news in Abilene and reportedly sat down in his office chair and was unable to speak for a full minute, which his wife described as the most remarkable thing she had witnessed in their marriage. Thomas came home for the holidays that year with the barely controlled excitement of a 12-year-old who is trying to be dignified about a baby brother and not quite managing it, and the sight of him holding Samuel with careful adolescent arms while Cora showed him exactly how to support the head was, Clyde thought, one of the better things he had been privileged to see. Life settled into the particular fullness of a household that is genuinely thriving. The ranch continued to grow in health and in profitability. The rotation system Cora had implemented became so obviously effective over its second and third seasons that even the ranchers in neighboring counties who had been skeptical of her methods began sending inquiries. Her consulting practice expanded steadily, and she managed it with the same methodical capability she managed everything, without drama, without excess, with clear-eyed attention to what was real. Clyde and Cora had their arguments, because they were both strong-willed people with opinions and the willingness to hold them, and some of those arguments were conducted at considerable volume in the ranch house kitchen, with the full privacy afforded by walls that were not quite thick enough for the arguing not to reach the bunkhouse. Doster, on one notable occasion, had apparently occupied the hands with a vigorous reorganization of the equipment shed for 2 hours, until the voices from the main house returned to their normal register, which he described afterward with the diplomatic brevity of a man who has learned the better part of valor. But they were good arguments, the kind that come from 2 people who take each other seriously, and they always arrived on the other side of them at something better than they had before, a clearer understanding, a more honestly negotiated position, a shared respect for the fact that neither of them was going to simply give way because it was easier. He loved her more as time passed. That was the thing that continued to surprise him, though he supposed it should not have. He had thought when he married her that he was at the peak of what he felt, that this was the high point of it, and it would plateau or gently decline as it normalized into the fabric of daily life. Instead it grew, quietly and steadily, the way the recovered pasture had grown, putting down deeper and stronger roots every season. Every year that passed gave him more of her, more of what she was and how she thought and what she loved and what she feared and what she was capable of, and every increment of that more was something he gathered and held with the same care she gave to recovering land. In 1886, they had a second child, a daughter they named Frances Ruth, who arrived in the early morning with the same directness her mother brought to everything, and who had Clyde's dark eyes and Cora's particular expression of focused evaluation, identifiable from the first week. Samuel, who was approaching 2 and had very decided opinions about his world, regarded her with a caution that shifted into devotion over the following months in the natural way of small children who decide a person is worth keeping. Thomas, now 14, and spending his summers at the ranch with increasing skill and usefulness, was visited by Francis's arrival with an emotion he expressed by becoming the most attentive and protective older brother in Harlan County, a role he took entirely seriously. The ranch by 1886 was one of the most respected operations in the county, not just for the size or the cattle but for the quality of the land management, which had become something people in the region discussed as a model. Clyde had not sought that reputation particularly, but he had not deflected it either, and he made sure in every conversation about it that the source of the methods was named correctly. "My wife," he would say simply, when people asked about the land management approach. "Not my land consultant, or the woman who advises on these matters. My wife," with the same iron certainty with which he had once told Hector Briggs that her word on the North Pasture was final. Cora, when she heard this attributed to her in the county, had the same expression she'd worn in the pasture when the grass first showed its recovery, that quiet, complete satisfaction that did not need to make itself loud to be real. In the autumn of 1887, Thomas returned from school in Abilene and announced that he had been accepted to study at the Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College, which had been established in College Station some years earlier and was becoming a serious institution. He wanted to study land management and agricultural science. He looked at both his father and his stepmother when he said this, with the particular honesty of a young man who knows exactly who he is crediting. Cora told him he was going to do extraordinary things. She said it with the same directness she brought to every certain statement she made, the directness that her students and clients and neighbors had learned to trust as the indicator of something she had examined carefully and found to be true. Clyde told his son he was proud of him, and meant it in the full depth of what that meant from a man who did not say things carelessly. Thomas left for College Station in January of 1888, carrying with him a set of surveying instruments that Cora had purchased for him from the same Kansas City supplier from which she had first ordered her own equipment, and a letter from her to a professor there who had written her about her methods the previous year, and who, she was fairly certain, would find Thomas as interesting a student as she had found the subject. By the spring of 1888, the Wilcox Ranch was 5 years into the land management program Cora had first designed in the fall of 1882, and the evidence of those 5 years was written across the land in a language that anyone could read. The North Pasture, that starting point of everything, was as healthy as Clyde's father had ever seen it in the best years, maybe healthier, because what Cora had built was not just a recovery, but a system that continued to improve and maintain. The creek rerouting had had ripple effects across the eastern sections that had benefited the whole property. The rotation system had been refined and adjusted over 5 seasons until it was precisely calibrated to the specific character of the Wilcox land, its seasons and its water, and its particular quality of grass. He rode the North Pasture one evening in April of that year, alone, just him and his horse in the last of the day's light, and he looked at what the land had become and thought about the morning 5 years earlier when he had stood at the fence and watched Cora cross the pasture with her instruments, a stranger on his land who had been nothing but a name in a letter and who had become, in the time since, the central fact of his life. She had changed everything. Not just the land, though the land was the evidence and the record, the visible proof of what she brought. She had changed him, in ways he was still discovering and would likely spend the rest of his life discovering, the ways that a person changes when they finally find someone who sees them completely and chooses to stay. He rode back to the house in the darkening evening, and he could see the lamplight in the kitchen window and the shape of her moving inside, and Samuel's smaller shape near her, and the sound when he opened the gate of Francis's voice from somewhere upstairs in the indistinct register of a 2-year-old conducting herself very seriously. The sounds of the house, full of his family, full of his life. She looked up when he came through the door, and the look she gave him was the look she had always given him, clear and direct and completely present, the look that had never become habitual, that still held in it the same quality of genuine choosing that it had had in the first weeks on the porch. "I rode the North Pasture," he said. "And," she said, "and you were right, from the very beginning, about all of it." She looked at him for a moment with that slight smile, the wry and warm one he had spent years learning the value of. "I know," she said. "Go wash your hands. Supper is in 15 minutes." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her temple, and she leaned into it for just a moment before turning back to the stove. And in the warmth and the lamplight, and the noise of the children and the smell of supper, and the deep-settled contentment of a house that was genuinely a home, Clyde Wilcox understood that he had been given a life of extraordinary richness, and that all of it, every thread of it, traced back to the particular and necessary courage of saying the thing he had almost been too proud to say. That she had the final word, that was not changing. That some things are true not because they are easy or convenient or comfortable, but because they are simply, plainly, correctly true, and the only honest thing to do with truth is to say it out loud and stand behind it. He had said it. She had heard it. The rest had followed. The years that came after were built on that foundation, as solid as the recovered land itself, and they grew things on it that neither of them had been certain they dared to want. And they turned out, as things that are grown from honest soil tend to do, to be more than either of them had imagined when the first seed was planted on a September afternoon in 1882. When a woman stepped off a stagecoach with a notebook and a surveying compass, and a letter bearing the signature of a proud cattleman who had not yet learned that the best thing he would ever do in his life was be humble enough to ask for help, and brave enough to stand firm when he found it. Samuel grew into a thoughtful and capable young man who eventually took up land management work alongside his mother's methods, adapting them with the natural evolution of a new generation building on what the previous one established. Frances, when she was old enough to be curious about the instruments in her mother's office, learned to use them with a precision that made Cora close her eyes for a moment and smile with the particular feeling of watching something continue. Thomas came home from the agricultural college in 1892 with a degree and a young woman he intended to marry and the beginnings of a professional reputation that Marcus, in Abilene, followed with an uncle's proprietary satisfaction. Clyde and Cora grew older together in the specific way of people who have built something real, slowly, and with full awareness of what they were building, collecting years the way the recovered land collected seasons, each one adding something rather than taking something away. He remained proud, stubborn, occasionally maddening, exactly as she had always known him to be. She remained clear-eyed, direct, unsentimental about everything except the things she truly loved, and about those she was sentimental in ways she only let him fully see. On their 10th anniversary, in April of 1893, he told her that she had changed everything, meaning the ranch and the land and the work and all the visible, measurable things. She told him that she knew. And then she told him that he had changed everything too, meaning things that were less visible but no less real, the trust rebuilt where it had been broken, the belief restored in the worth of being chosen and choosing back, the discovery that a life shared with the right person is something categorically different from a life managed alone, no matter how capable you are of the managing. He held her hand. She held his. The North Pasture lay green and permanent beyond the window, the most enduring argument for what they had made together, the proof written in grass and water and good soil that recovery is possible when someone cares enough to understand what a thing needs, and when someone else is brave enough to say clearly and mean it all the way down. She has the final word, and that is not changing.